Shalom guys, the topic I will present today comes back like a boomerang. Whenever I mention the temple in my episodes, people keep commenting about alternative locations of the temple. Therefore, I decided to create a comprehensive summary video where I will present the most important evidence for the true location of the temple. Now, this is not my first video on the topic and I will include information that was mentioned before. I have to repeat certain arguments for this video to be comprehensive, so you have two options. You can either watch them again with some new graphics that I made or skip to the parts which interest you the most. I will include chapters in this video to make it easy for you. You can find them in the description of this episode and watch the most exciting parts. But before we get into this topic, please don't forget to subscribe to this channel, like the video and leave a comment. We're getting close to 200,000 subscribers and it will be wonderful if we could reach it soon. With that out of the way, let's dive into the temple's location. We'll be speaking a lot about the city of David, therefore it is very important to know where it is located. So, the city of David was built on the eastern hill between the Mount of Olives and the western hill. According to archaeological finds, this hill holds the original settlement core of Bronze and Iron Age Jerusalem. In other words, this is where Jewish history with Jerusalem began and where David set up the capital for Israel. In this modern picture of Jerusalem that you can see now, you can see the area of the city of David, the place called Milo, which was a structure that supported significant buildings in the ancient past. Some believe that David built his palace on the top of this structure. We can also see the Ophel, which served as a type of extension of the city of David, and also this place holds ruins of many historical buildings. If you visit this place, you can see a mosaic of architecture from different periods. North to the Ophel, you have the traditional Temple Mount with the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock. The Temple Mount is the traditional place where Jewish people and most archaeologists believe the temple was located. And to the left of the Temple Mount, you see the iconic Western Wall with the Wailing Wall Plaza. This is the place where Jews gather to pray, as they believe the walls are remains of a supportive structure for the temple itself, built by Herod the Great. Additionally, I would like to mention the location of the Gihon Spring, located on the eastern side of the city of David, close to the Kidron Valley. Please remember the location of the Gihon Spring that is actually located beneath the city of David, very close to the Kidron Valley and not in the city itself. So, now let's go back in time and see a 3D reconstruction showing how the city of David might have looked like in ancient days. The eastern hill was chosen as a perfect place to settle because of the Gihon Spring, of course. Water on the desert is a true miracle and a source of life. The ancient people knew this well and built walls and huge towers stretching down the hill to protect the very source of the spring. The city was fortified by the Jebusites that walled the city and built a citadel of Zion, of which we read in the Bible. Today we know this is true because huge stones have been found and bear witness to the massive tower that protected the spring. Even today, the Gihon Spring is still gushing out the water from beneath the rocks. This is one of the proofs showing where the city of David was located. Around the spring, foundations of buildings have been found that continued to function throughout David's reign and up to their destruction in 586 by the Babylonian Empire. Please remember that common houses existed in this spot before the Babylonian destruction. I will come back to this important fact later in the video. David conquered the city using the ancient tunnels used by the Jebusites to collect the water for the city. Apparently, there was a secret entrance to one of the tunnels beneath the hill that David's warrior Joab used to enter the city. Again today, archaeologists found the tunnels that the Bible speaks about, and you can walk through those tunnels yourself, if you like, of course. Next, we read that David conquered the city, established it as the capital of Israel, and built a palace for himself on the top of the hill. The palace probably replaced the so-called Citadel of Zion. Proto-Aeolic capitals were found in the place believed to be the location of David's palace. The columns themselves attest to the time of David. In the Bible, we read that David brought the Ark of the Covenant and housed it in a tent. We do not actually know where this tent was located, but it seemed logical it was placed in the city of David, perhaps close to his palace. King David was not satisfied with the fact that the ark was placed in a tent. He wished to build a temple for it, but God stopped him and pronounced that the house of God will be built by David's offspring. Instead, God tells David through the prophet Gad to go up and build an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. We read about it in the book of 2 Samuel 24. Where was the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite? Well, from the passage in 2 Samuel, we know it was located above where David was residing, which means up from David's palace. A threshing floor like that sold by Araunah would have been a large open elevated area to facilitate threshing. It would undoubtedly be outside of the city and indeed not where the Gihon Spring is. There is no place there, as there were structures built there by the Jebusites. Here are some historical pictures showing you how a threshing floor looks like. When you look at those pictures, you can see a wide space that was needed. The top of Mount Moriah was big enough to hold such a place. Additionally, a threshing floor would never be located near the spring, as the particles of the grain would contaminate the fresh drinking water. Further, the Bible associates the threshing floor of Araunah with Mount Moriah. In the book of 2 Chronicles 3:1 we read, "Then Solomon began to build the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to his father David. It was on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite, the place provided by David." And we already established that the threshing floor was above from the city of David, so it was definitely not in the city of David. In other words, the threshing floor of Araunah equals Mount Moriah. Mount Moriah is where we read Abraham brought his son Isaac for sacrifice. In Genesis 22:2 we read, "Then God said, 'Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain. I will show you.'" So Abraham was to sacrifice his son on a mountain in the region of Moriah. And then we read in Genesis 22:4 and 5, "On the third day Abraham looked up," again notice him looking up like David, "and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, 'Stay here with the donkey, while I and the boy go up over there. We will worship and then we will come back to you.'" This story teaches us several things. First of all, this is a new place for Abraham. God says to Abraham that the sacrifice will happen on a mountain that will be shown to him. Abraham knew Salem, future Jebus, and Jerusalem because in Genesis 14, Abraham meets Melchizedek, who is the king of Salem. Where is Salem? Well, the Bible identified Salem as a city that existed before the creation of Jebus and the city of David. Salem was definitely connected to Jerusalem because we read in Psalm 76, which connects God's tabernacle in Salem with Zion, and Zion itself is synonymous with Jerusalem. In Psalm 76 we read, His tabernacle is in Salem. His dwelling place also is in Zion. Psalm 76:2. So once again, Abraham knew Salem, and the Bible tells us that the place where he was to sacrifice his son is going to be a new place for him. Second, we read that it was up on a mountain. Abraham had to look up to see it. In ancient times, places of worship were built on mountain tops. We know of such practices from the Bible and also secular history. Salem, on the other hand, was not located on a mountain top. It was built on a ridge, but not a mountain top. Third, Abraham would probably not sacrifice his son in the city of Salem. Instead, we read that Abraham leaves his servants with a donkey. After a long journey, the servants probably stayed in Salem and gave water to their donkey. This seems to be quite logical from the narrative presented in the Bible. Why am I stressing the fact that both the threshing floor of Araunah and Mount Moriah was not in the city of David? I am stressing this and providing you with a geography because there is a popular theory suggesting that the temple in Jerusalem was actually built in the city of David, above the Gihon spring. Okay, as we have established some essential things concerning the topography of the city of David and Jerusalem, now we can look into this popular theory in more detail. The whole discussion about a different location of the Temple Mount than the traditional Jewish understanding started with Ernest L. Martin 1999 book, The Temples That Jerusalem Forgot. Now, Martin is probably the person that made this theory quite popular, but there are others like Merlin Sams and Robert Kornacki. It is not my intention to say bad things about those people, and perhaps they truly believe that the temple was in the city of David. They have a right to do so. However, unfortunately, their belief penetrates the internet and they influence the thinking of many people. And so it must be said, however, that no respected archaeologist in Israel would ever say that the temple was in the city of David. In Israel, there are basically two schools of archaeology. One school of archaeology, represented by people like Elliot Mazar, sees the Bible as a reliable source of information that can help archaeological discoveries. The other school, and archaeologists such as Israel Finkelstein, are skeptical of the biblical narrative and certainly do not see it as a primary source of information. Both schools of archaeology disagree on many conclusions about the findings, but as to the Temple Mount location, there is no discussion in Israel. People who ate their teeth on archaeology in Israel do not doubt that the evidence is clear that the Temple Mount is the location of the Jewish temple. On the other hand, we have people like Martin, Sams, and Kornacki who are definitely not experts in archaeology and try to present a revelation that contradicts generations of detailed analysis of the land. And this is the biggest problem, that they usually take a bit of information and transform it into something totally different. And I must say this, they abuse the lack of knowledge of many people about the topography and the archaeological finds that contradict their theory. Then they use this bit of information to popularize their teaching. Therefore, in this video, we will take a close look at some of their claims and confront them with the hard facts. So, to remind everyone, what are we talking about? Martin and his followers, this is how I will call this group, argues that Haram al-Sharif, which is Arabic for the Temple Mount, is not the location of the temple. They assert that the temples of Jerusalem were located over the Gihon Spring and not over the Dome of the Rock. Their argument for this theory can be divided into two parts. The first part tries to use the Bible as a source that claims that the temple was located in the city of David. How do they do it? Well, they claim that the Bible uses the name Zion and associates it with the city of David. Here is a clip of Bob Kornacki's speech where he says it himself.
So the Bible says, nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David. 2 Samuel 5:7. Very interesting verses we're going to go through, because Scripture says, nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David. He took it by what? Going up the water shaft, or filling up the water shaft, as Ellie said, or the water area, and going, okay?
So, Kornacki is basically saying that this verse from 2 Samuel 5:7, where it says, nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, that is, the city of David, means that every time you see the term Zion, you should connect it to the city of David. So, in other words, they say it can't mean anything else. But can it mean something else than the city of David? Of course it can. As we research the Bible uses of the word Zion, we find that it may represent different things. The word Zion may represent the whole city of Jerusalem. We see an example of that in 2 Kings 19:31, where we read, "For out of Jerusalem will come forth a remnant, and out of Mount Zion survivors." This verse is talking about the preservation of the Jewish people when the judgment will come. Just to give you a context, those are the words that King Hezekiah heard when he prayed to God for salvation from the approaching Assyrian army. We know the story and learn that Jerusalem was not conquered by Sanherib, but was saved through a miracle. God sent an angel that destroyed the Assyrian army gathered around Jerusalem. So here the term Zion refers to the whole city of Jerusalem, which includes the eastern hill, Mount Moriah, and the western hill. So it definitely does not mean just the city of David. That would not be logical in this scenario. Zion may also refer to an unspecified general location in Jerusalem. In Psalm 14:7 we read, "Oh, that the salvation of Israel would come out of Zion, when the Lord restores his captive people. Jacob will rejoice, Israel will be glad." It is hard to argue that this psalm refers to the city of David. Instead, it is referring to the work of the Messiah, who will save the Jewish people and restore peace on earth. Zion may also refer to Israel as a nation. In Psalm 69, verse 39, we read, "For God will save Zion and build the cities of Judah, that they may dwell there and possess it." So in this verse, Zion represents the nation of Israel and not just the city of David. Those are just 3 examples of how the word Zion may be used. So in other words, it is very inappropriate to associate Zion just with the city of David. The biblical use of the word is much broader, and it seems unwise to base your geographical theology on a single use of the term that in reality refers to many things. The second argument from the Bible that Martin and his followers try to use are the words of Jesus, who said that no one stone from the temple would be left standing. Again, here is a clip of Kornacki making this argument.
Because it says in Matthew 24, "Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said to them, 'Do you not see all these things? Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down.'" Not one stone. What do you see there? You see more than one stones?
So Kornacki points to the western wall and says, "See? You have stones. So this can't be the place. This is a good example how they take some bits of information and twist it for their use. People who present this argument show their lack of understanding of what we are looking at, or simply twist the truth for their benefit. There is nothing left from the temple. No one stone of the temple is standing one on another. If you go up the Temple Mount, you can see trees planted on the Temple Mount. This corresponds well with the words of Micah, who writes, "Zion will be plowed like a field, Jerusalem will become a heap of rubble, the Temple Hill, a mount overgrown with thickets." I made a video where I go up to the Temple Mount. You can see it yourself how it looks. I'm leaving a link in the description of this episode, so check it out. And here you can actually see a tractor plowing the ground on the Temple Mount. So the words of the prophet Micah are being actually fulfilled. The stones that are left are not part of the temple, but are stones that are left over from a huge supportive structure built by Herod. If you actually go down the western tunnels, you can see those stones and understand how big they are. Those massive stones were used by Herod to enlarge the temple itself. He did it to expand the temple complex that facilitated thousands of worshippers every day. The biggest stones weighed hundreds of tons. The Roman soldiers destroyed what they could, but to get rid of those massive stones, you would need explosives, or perhaps Hulk. By the way, the stones that we see resemble Herodian styles. The Romans would not bother to build such massive stones in a place that they didn't even care about. Jerusalem for them was always a province that didn't matter that much. On the contrary, Herod is known to build crazy projects where he used engineers to create unbelievable structures. A palace on a steep hill in the middle of the desert and a massive harbor city in Caesarea, where he also used massive stones and placed them precisely on each other in the middle of the sea, are two of the more known examples of his engineering. So you can't use Jesus' words and say they prove your theory because the Western Wall is standing. Jesus was referring to the temple, and there is no one stone standing of the temple. Okay, so we discussed the two main arguments from the biblical text that Martin and his followers use. Now it's time for the archaeology, history and common sense part, and this is where the fun begins. The first one we will tackle is the Gihon Spring location. For Martin and his followers, the temple had to be located over the Gihon Spring to provide water for the temple. There is even a drawing showing you how it could look like. Look at this picture. So, in order for the temple to fit the city of David, a platform is created that would support it. You can see that Martin places the temple on his drawing just next to the Ophel. We know where the Ophel is located because we discussed it in the beginning of the video. So, if you look at the map, the temple location on today's map would be about here. Now, I also created a 3D model to see where Martin's temple would stand. So the first thing you can already see is how the temple just does not fit the geographical topography. The platform on Martin's drawing is gigantic and goes into the Kidron and Tyropeon Valley. Imagine how much stone would be needed just to build that and fill the gaps. Now compare it with the traditional location of the temple. Here the temple simply fits. Mount Moriah is big enough to hold it. But that's not the only problem with Martin's model. Look where the Gihon Spring is. It is not under the temple, but much lower in the Kidron Valley. I also mentioned this in the beginning of the video, and if you want to feel the waters of the Gihon Spring, you need to go beneath the city of David. So already, we see that the argument that the temple had to be above the Gihon Spring does not make sense in Martin's model. Martin says that it would make more sense to build the temple close to the Gihon spring because water is essential to the temple functioning. And so he says that transporting water to the Temple Mount would be very difficult. But looking at the model and understanding geography, it would be much easier to transport water to the traditional Temple Mount than the monster that Martin created. Water would have to be somehow pumped up on this massive platform presented by Martin. And I agree, Gihon Spring was very important for Jerusalem water supply, but it was not the only water source of Jerusalem. On the Temple Mount, Charles Warren documented at least 43 cisterns for collecting water. Some of the water cisterns, such as cistern number 7 and 8, were enormous underground water reservoirs, capable of holding some 2 million gallons of water. Most of these cisterns were initially underground quarries, from which building stones for the building of the Temple Mount was taken. After the quarrying activity were stopped, these caverns were plastered and became water reservoirs. One of the cisterns, numbered 8, is very big and it dates to the first temple times. So please tell me, if there was nothing on the Temple Mount in the time of Solomon, as Martin and those that follow him claim, why would the ancient people bother to create such a huge cistern on the Temple Mount? This cistern is very similar to the ancient cisterns found in Beersheba and Bet Shemesh, but much larger. An archaeologist, Eli Shukron, who also excavated this cistern and tested the plaster, agrees that this cistern was used in the first temple times. The Jewish commentaries on the Torah, such as the Mishnah, also refers to great cisterns that were located on the Temple Mount. Those are those cisterns mentioned in the Mishnah. So why is there so many water cisterns on the Temple Mount? The answer is simple, because huge amounts of water was needed to flush away the blood from the sacrifices that were performed on the Temple Mount. People who believe that the temple was located in the city of David can't explain why there are such huge cisterns under the Temple Mount from the first temple period. If there was nothing on the Temple Mount, then why are there cisterns located in this location? And most importantly, cisterns that date to the times of Solomon. Okay, but cisterns are storage places. You still need water to be transported on the Temple Mount. One way to gather water in ancient times was through rain. In the Masada fortress built by Herod, you can see the remains of channels that collected the rainwater and directed it to giant cisterns. This is why during the Jewish revolt against the Roman Empire, which began in 66 AD, the rebels withstood so long a Roman siege. Of course, rainwater would not be enough for the temple. You could not rely just on rainwater, especially considering that Israel is a region that often experienced years of drought. For a proper and uninterrupted sacrificial system on the Temple Mount, you would need a constant flow of water. We know that in Herod's reign there were actually aqueducts that transported fresh water from Etam Spring. Etam Spring fed the lower aqueduct coming from a spring of Etam near Bethlehem and the Solomon Pools located at the head of the Urtas Valley, from where water was transported to the temple court by the subterranean aqueduct some 10 miles in length. This aqueduct has gone into ruin long ago, so that no water from the spring now reaches Jerusalem, but it did function in the past. And according to the Jewish sources, the Etam Spring was the water source for the temple, reaching the temple by means of the lower aqueduct. This aqueduct brought fresh water to cleanse the temple court of the sacrificial blood each evening. The aqueducts would have been built for this purpose by King Solomon when he built the temple. Some claim this lower aqueduct was built by the Hashmoneans in the 2nd century BC, but the Hashmoneans would have merely repaired or improved an already existing aqueduct. We can conduct that Solomon would not have relied on cisterns to supply the large amount of water needed on a daily basis to supply the temple, especially in an arid country that experienced consecutive years of drought. Instead, Solomon built a complex water aqueduct cistern from Hebron through Bethlehem to Jerusalem in about 950 BC. Evidently, this water system was incorporated as a major design of the temple itself. Solomon knew that the Gihon spring in the city of David did not have enough head, meaning water pressure or lift, to supply the temple above. The springs near Hebron are much higher in elevation than the Temple Mount. You can even check that by googling the elevation of Hebron and Jerusalem. Then you can clearly read that Hebron is higher. This is very important for transporting water. You need to have a higher place from which you will transport water to the lower place. This is how gravity works. If it's the other way around, meaning transporting water from a lower place to a higher place, so like it would be from Gihon Spring, then you need energy. But let me illustrate how the aqueducts worked in transporting water. They functioned as a sealed siphon system, and they would work like a water hose. Let's say you want to drain your above-ground swimming pool in your backyard. You stick one end of the hose in the pool and the other one on the ground. The net difference of head is determined by the height difference between the level of the water in the pool and where the water leaves the hose. As you lift the hose from the ground to the top of the water in the pool, the water flow rate diminishes, then stops when there is no difference in elevation. Municipal water towers use exactly the same principle and are only used when there is a power failure and the electric pumps cannot create the water pressure. It really doesn't matter how high or low the water hose is in the middle, as long as the place the water comes out is lower than where the water enters. In this way, they could get the water all the way from just north of Bethlehem, about 10 miles to Jerusalem, to supply the temple with all the water it needed to wash away the blood from the sacrifices. So, the lowest part of the aqueduct reached the Temple Mount through the Jewish Quarter and the Wilson's Bridge. By analyzing elevation heights of the beginning of the aqueduct and the end, we can see that there was significant potential water pressure with 21 meters of gross head at the highest point of the Temple Mount. The level at Solomon's Pools near Bethlehem is 765 meters above sea level. The level at the top of the rock under the dome is 744 meters. We know Solomon used a sealed conduct system, so we know there was an ample water pressure to supply lots of water to the Temple Mount based on laws of physics, including a friction loss calculation. It's really that simple. Imagine a water tower installed on the temple platform that is 25 meters in the air. This would give excellent water pressure at about 30 psi, pounds per square inch. Our modern city water pressure is about 60 to 70 psi. So, the most natural water supply for the temple would be in fact the Hebron Springs. By the way, the Etam Spring was the spring under the temple that Aristeas was referring to. Letter of Aristeas was written in 150 BC and mentions a spring under the temple. About 400 years later, the Roman historian Tacitus gave another reference to the temple at Jerusalem, which had within its precincts a natural spring of water that issued from its interior. Those two references, Aristeas and Tacitus, are not describing the Gihon spring, but the Etam spring. So water was transported from the hill country of Hebron and Bethlehem, where the three pools called Solomon pools were created to accumulate water for the temple. The estimated capacity of all three pools is about 40 million gallons. It is believed that Solomon himself originally dug one or all three pools at Etam and the first aqueduct to feed his new temple in Jerusalem. And there are some biblical references that suggest it is true. In Ecclesiastes 2:6 we can read, "I made ponds of water for myself, from which to irrigate a forest of growing trees." Additionally, Josephus writes, "The king," meaning Solomon, "himself rode upon a chariot in the midst of those men, who were still in armor, and had their bows fitted to them. He had on a white garment, and used to take his progress out of the city in the morning. There was a certain place, about 50 furlongs distant from Jerusalem, which is called Etam, very pleasant. It is in fine gardens, and abounding in rivulets of water." So those are the two references that recognize the importance of Etam in Solomon's times. This is very interesting. And while some archaeology surrounding the pools of Solomon and the aqueducts date to the Hashmonean or early Roman periods, that's 100 to 10 BC, it is very likely that those were remodeling and upgrading projects of an older system that date back to the time of Solomon. It is just common sense. Why would the Hashmoneans, Herod the Great, and the Romans build aqueducts if, as Martin followers suggest, the water problem was solved by the Gihon spring? The answer is simple. The Gihon spring was not a solution, and you needed the force of gravity to supply the temple in water. Additionally, it must be said that, as was correctly recognized almost from the moment of its discovery, Wilson's Arch supported a bridge that led from the Temple Mount west across the Central Valley to the western hill of the city. But the purpose of the bridge, as indicated by the aqueduct still running above it, was to convey water. It was not primarily for human traffic. It was built by Herod the Great late in the 1st century to replace an earlier bridge built, as we are told by Josephus, by the Maccabean rulers and destroyed during Pompey's conquest of Jerusalem in 63 BC. And what is astonishing is that this channel of water can still be observed today in Jerusalem and goes directly to the Temple Mount. There are several places where the end of Solomon's ancient aqueduct pipes can be seen in the Temple Mount area. Here are two places you still see the end of Solomon's conduct very near the Temple Mount. Those two photographs were taken by Steve Rood on the stairs that led from the upper streets down to the Wailing Wall. If you visit Jerusalem and the Wailing Wall, you probably passed right by those, but didn't know it. So, the water conduct that supplied the temple in Jerusalem began in the area of Hebron Mountains, passed through Solomon Pools near Bethlehem, and flowed to Jerusalem. Again, logic of those that propose an alternative view of the Temple Mount location is questionable. The models they provide show that the water would have to be pumped up. It does not matter if the temple was in the city of David or the Temple Mount. In any case, water would have to be pumped up. Actually, as I mentioned, it would be easier to transport water to the Temple Mount than the model that Martin proposes. And no, the Gihon spring was not that strong to shoot water up that high as presented on the 3D model. Again, they worry about the water for the temple sacrifices, But they don't worry about the space needed to perform those sacrifices. Thousands of sacrifices would be performed during biblical feasts. Herod enlarged the temple platform to enable even more sacrifices to be performed. But even if you take the original dimensions of Solomon's temple, it simply does not fit in the city of David. The Mishnah, which is the Jewish commentary, tells us that the square platform on which the temple stood was measuring 500 square cubits. Now, if you look at the city of David, there is just no space for that kind of platform. The platform would stick out from the top of the mountain. You must realize that the ridge on which the city of David was built is very narrow. There is just no space on it to build a temple. In the city of David, we don't find anything on the ground that would suggest a temple stood there. But what we find in the proposed location by Martin and his followers tells us that the temple could never be located in the city of David. When you go to visit the city of David, make sure to check out Milo area. In this location, by the way, this is the location where Martin and his followers put the temple. So, in this very spot, you will see remains of buildings that existed there till their destruction in 586 BC by the Babylonian army. So, on the spot where Martin and his followers locate the temple, you have common houses. So what are they proposing? That the temple stood on the roof of those common houses? Archaeologists found toilets from the 6th century BC in this place. Can you imagine? And still think that the temple was located here? Additionally, in that spot on the edges of the city of David, they found a wall of trash that was dumped there during the 1st century and later. So, are they suggesting that the temple stood on trash? Am I understanding this right? Okay, so according to Martin and his followers, the temple stood in the city of David, which we have presented that it can't be. So, what stood on the traditional Temple Mount according to them? Well, what Martin and his followers always say is that Josephus writes that Fort Antonia always stationed a legion of Roman soldiers, and therefore on the traditional Temple Mount you actually had a Roman fort. So let's look at this claim. A Roman legion was the largest military unit of the Roman army and composed usually of 4,200 infantry and 300 cavalry. And so the proponents of the Fort Antonia on the Temple Mount say that it is a clear sign showing that the Temple Mount had to be a Roman fort because only a space that large could hold a Roman fort with a legion of Roman soldiers. But this is a different sign that shows that those that propagate this view did not do their homework. If we look at the writings of Josephus in Greek in which he wrote, there is no word for legion in the description of Fort Antonia. This is the famous verse where they take the word legion from. The translation of it goes like this: a Roman battalion or order was always based there, and armed men stood around the porticos during the festivals to keep watch on the people and prevent any revolt. The word tagma can be translated as battalion or order. You can actually paste this word to an online translator and see the result yourself. There is a word for legion in Greek, and it's legiona. Therefore, if you find a translation of the word tagma as legion, it is a mistake or an interpretation, but the word proper translation is simply order or battalion. Josephus also uses this word tagma to describe the Sadducees and the Essenes, and it certainly should not be translated as legion, but rather an order of people. So, this whole argument built on one word does not make any sense, but let's suppose it means legion. After all, Martin and his followers provide dimensions of other Roman forts and observe that since the Temple Mount would fit such a fort, then it must be the location of a Roman fort. But this is too little evidence to produce such wild conclusions. Yes, there was Fort Antonia on the Temple Mount, and we know exactly where it was. Josephus writes that the Fort Antonia was higher than the temple, and if you look at this map, you can see an elevation over the Temple Mount. This is where Fort Antonia stood. An older picture of the Temple Mount shows the location of Fort Antonia. In this picture, you can see that the Muslim school built on this elevation is higher than the Temple Mount. And I want to emphasize this really strong. Think what it would mean if a Roman fort was located on the Temple Mount. Think of the implications of that. If a Roman legion was actually located in a proper Roman fort on an elevated area as the Temple Mount, the Jews would never be able to take control of the Temple Mount. Remember, we are talking of the best trained military unit in ancient world. A legion was a war machine feared by all the armies of the world. And if we go back to Josephus' writings, he says the Jewish rebels took control of Fort Antonia in 2 days. It took 5 months for several Roman legions to take back the control of the Temple Mount. The Jews would have to have Superman or Hulk on their side to conquer a proper Roman fort with a legion inside in just 2 days. Logically, there was of course no legion in Fort Antonia, but as Josephus writes, a smaller unit of Roman soldiers. How big was this unit? Well, this is a good question. People like Leon Rittmeyer suggest a Roman cohort was located at Fort Antonia, which was generally composed of about 480 soldiers. This would be in harmony with the New Testament account of Paul's arrest. In Acts 21 and 22, the apostle is recorded as having been brought up from the Temple Mount by stairs into a castle, which would have been nothing other than Fort Antonia itself. Then we read that Paul is allowed to address the Jewish people that were standing below on the Temple Mount. In chapter 23, we read that in order to save Paul's life, the tribune ordered 2 sentries to get ready 200 soldiers with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen to go as far as Caesarea at the 3rd hour of the night. This would have amounted to 2/3 of the cohort that was stationed in the grounds of Antonia. But you may say that the proposed dimensions of Antonia Fortress are even too small to host Roman cohort of about 500 soldiers. Josephus wrote that the Antonia Fortress was built on a rock that was 50 cubits, that's 86 feet or 26.25 meters high. The fortress had towers at its 4 corners. And although the rock plateau on which the fortress stood is a sizable piece of real estate, measuring approximately 148 feet 45 meters from north to south and 394 feet, that's 120 meters from east to west, it's still not big enough. Now, if you go to the Temple Mount, you can actually see this rock sticking out of the Temple Mount. And this is a big space, but it is indeed difficult to imagine that a cohort of about 500 soldiers and their horses would have campaigned inside this fortress. However, I would agree with Leon Rittmeyer, who believes that it would be a mistake to limit the boundaries of Antonia to the rocky plateau only. The Struthion Pool that was found in Jerusalem close to the Fort Antonia location would have provided water for the Roman soldiers garrisoned here and would have been protected. At a distance of about 60 meters to the north is a high rock scarp that enclosed a large area where later the Eastern Roman Forum was built. It is therefore reasonable to suggest that the common soldiers camp out here in a semi-permanent barracks, while the officers and commanders stayed in a more luxurious and permanent accommodation on the top of Antonia Rockscarp. Also, remember that Jerusalem lost its significance after Herod's death. The procurators of Judea were generally subordinate to the procurator of Syria, and their seat of government was in Caesarea, the main port and economic center of the Holy Land, which thus became the real capital of Judea. The Roman procurator would go up to Jerusalem from Caesarea during the free pilgrimage festivals. While his attendance at the festival ceremonies was a form of respect toward the citizens, it was also a military significance. He would be always accompanied by a military force which served as a warning against rebellion, since such large festivals gatherings have the people a feeling of strength. While in Jerusalem, the procurator would reside in Herod's palace, which became the property of Rome, or less likely in Fort Antonia, now the headquarters of the military garrison in the city. But even when a large force of Roman soldiers was brought to Jerusalem during the festivals, for example, they would not have been camped in one place like Fort Antonia, but would be spread out in Jerusalem. And there is also something very important that I would like to mention, and something that is often omitted by the proponents of Martin theory. And that is that Fort Antonia was not built by Romans. They used what was already there. The fort overlooking the Temple Mount was built by the Hashmoneans in the 2nd century BC, and only then was it reused and modernized by Herod for the Romans. Archaeology actually confirms this, and Herodian masonry has been found under the modern structures. Another question that should be asked here is this: why would the Jews build a fortress after a typical Roman fort? It just does not make any sense. Also, is Martin and his followers saying that generations of Jewish people are stupid and they are praying next to the walls that actually the Romans built? I mean, this is very cynical, and I don't know, it's hard to imagine the intentions. So those are just answers to arguments that Martin and his followers make. But there are also other findings around the Temple Mount that prove that the temple was located in this spot. I will just mention a few that I think are the most important. The first important find is the Trumpeting Place inscription, which is an inscribed stone from the 1st century AD discovered in 1968 by Benjamin Mazar in his early excavations of the southern wall of the Temple Mount. This was a directional sign for the priest who blew a trumpet announcing the beginning and end of Shabbat in the Second Temple period. This stone would be located on the southwest corner of the temple complex. Here you can see a 3D showing where it would be located. On the western side of the temple, they also found the 4 gates that would lead to the temple. I made an episode dedicated to all the gates that led to Herod's temple. I will leave a link to this video in the description of this episode, so make sure to check it out. If you go to the Davidson Archaeological Park located next to the western wall, you will also see huge stones that were thrown down by the Romans when they destroyed the temple. Those stones are the testimony of a massive destruction done by the Romans. Next to the stones, they also found remains of shops where merchants would sell items for the pilgrims coming to the temple. Additionally, over 50 ritual baths called a mikvah have been found around the Temple Mount. Most of these are found beneath the mount's southern wall, an area jam-packed with millennia-old antiques. At any one time, there would be thousands of pilgrims in need of ritual cleansing before entering the temple. Because we need to understand that the temple needed a massive infrastructure around for it to function properly. Only a space around the Temple Mount could accommodate that. In the city of David, there is simply no space, not enough space to do that. Now, tell me, why are there so many ritual baths around the Temple Mount and not in the city of David? Because the temple was on the Temple Mount and not in the city of David. I mentioned pilgrims, right? Well, recently there is a new attraction opened for the tourists. The attraction is the Pilgrim's Road, which starts at the bottom of the city of David next to the pool of Siloam, which will be excavated further later on. Now, guess where this road leads to? It leads to the Temple Mount, because pilgrims coming to Jerusalem wanted to go to the Temple Mount. It does not lead to the proposed location by Martin and his followers, because there was no temple in the city of David. Finally, I want to mention something extraordinary about the Golden Gate. The exterior face of the gate, as it remains from the 16th century, is a sealed double entrance that leads into two vaulted halls. Even though the face of the gate has a 16th century appearance, there is strong evidence that this gate stands on remains of ancient gate built by the Jews that led to the first temple built by Solomon himself. Archaeologists have found physical remains of first temple masonry visible around this gate, and inside today's Golden Gate, original posts were found that supported the entrance to the temple. In the Second Temple times, the eastern gate to Jerusalem was called the Shushan Gate. In 1969, the archaeologist Dr. James Fleming discovered an archway that is located buried directly under the current Gate of Mercy. By the way, the Gate of Mercy is another name for the Golden Gate. Many believe that this arch was leading through stairs to the Shushan Gate. So, why do we have Solomonic stones in this spot if, according to Martin and his followers, the temple was never located here? The answer is again simple, because the temple was located here and not in the city of David. To end this video, I want to recommend an additional video that I have also published, which talks about further proof that Solomon Temple stood on the Temple Mount. Make sure to check out this video. I will leave a link in the description of this episode. Thank you for your attention. This was a long video, but I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to subscribe to the channel, as I will publish more of such content in the future. Also, if you think that my work is helpful, please consider supporting the channel through the Patreon page. If you go to my main channel page, you can click the Patreon button that will direct you to my Patreon page, so you can become my patron. That would be very cool. So, have a good day and see you in the next episode.